An Anatomy of the U.S. Credit Rating Downgrade, or May Keynesian Spending Rest in Peace. Hi, I'm Todd, and this is the On Wealth and Progress podcast. This week, as Congress prepared to pass Trump's Big Beautiful Bill, Moody's announced a downgrade to its U.S. credit rating. Of course, as we'll see in a moment, the timing of the recent downgrade reflects almost as poorly on Moody's as it does on the United States. The real danger to our credit ratings arose long ago, which is why Moody's main rival, Standard & Poor's, downgraded the U.S. back in 2011. Remarkably, just over 2 decades ago, our financial position seemed beyond reproach. In 2000, our budgets were in surplus, not a deficit, surplus, and total debt held by the public was only a very safe 33% of gross domestic product, or GDP. Today, the ratio is nearly 100%. As I've noted elsewhere, the Federal Reserve's ability to forecast key economic turning points is no better than anyone else's. And no one is very good at this. For proof, we need look no further than the remarks of then Fed Chairman Alan Greenspan, who in 2001 commented, "While the magnitudes of future federal unified budget surpluses are uncertain, they are highly likely to remain sizable for some time." In fact, the federal government has run a deficit, not a surplus, in every year since. So how exactly did we manage to go from Greenspan's sunny expectations to a credit downgrade in such a short time? Let's start with the basics, and then we'll get into the details. The first thing to understand is that running budget deficits simply means we are spending more than we are taking in. When a government consistently runs budget deficits, it has to get the money from somewhere, which it does by borrowing, printing more money, or both. For various reasons, our budget deficits over the past 25 years have primarily led to increased borrowings rather than inflation, with one key exception that we'll get to later. To finish up with the basics, if a government runs deficits that are too large for too long, it will experience problems of the type that led to our debt being downgraded. To show how we allowed all of this to happen, we're going to focus on 3 key points. First, I'll show that our deficits over the past 25 years were the result of spending problems, not revenue problems. And then we'll see that these spending problems fall into 2 categories. So the second key point will be that our dangerous debts resulted primarily from a failed attempt to spend our way out of the Great Recession. And then third, I'm going to show how our current deficits are the result of chronic spending problems that developed even during non-recessionary periods. So let's start with Part 1. Houston, we have a spending problem. When Ronald Reagan lowered the top tax bracket from 70% all the way down to 28% during the 1980s, the howls of Democratic protests about the rich soaking the poor could be heard from the canyons of Wall Street to the cottages of Middle America to the coastline of California. Even as a young CPA, I, like most others, didn't understand that these significant reductions in top marginal tax rates would have little impact on overall federal revenue collections, which is the key to understanding deficits. You can only imagine my surprise when, years later, I started looking into the facts of the matter. In the late 1960s, tax rates for top earners were over 70%, and federal revenues averaged 17.4% of GDP. In the late 1980s, after Reagan cut the top rate from over 70% down to 28%, federal revenues actually increased a bit to 17.5%. Now, to show how little things have changed, from 2020 to 2024, tax revenues averaged 17.2%. Perhaps even more remarkably, there's been scarcely any difference between Democrats and Republicans on these matters. Under Democratic administrations, revenues have averaged about 17.4% of GDP, and this dates all the way back to John F. Kennedy in the 1960s, up through the Biden administration that I just referenced in the early 2020s. And under Republican administrations, the average is just a little bit lower at 17.2%. Now, how can this be? Well, when top tax brackets are high, as was the case under Kennedy and Johnson in the 60s, Washington passes deductions and loopholes that help high earners lower their tax burdens. And then when rates are reduced, as happened with Reagan, those deductions are stripped away, and overall tax collections as a share of GDP tend to remain about where they were before. Now, of course, there's another common refrain that we hear all the time, and that is, if the rich would just pay a little more, a fair share, we could do so much more to help others. But as we've seen in practice, higher rates don't lead to higher government revenues under any kind of administration, Republican or Democrat. And this brings to mind the old line: how can you tell when a politician is lying? Answer: their lips are moving. The idea also belies the fact that we already have one of, if not the most, progressive income tax systems in the world. Roughly 1/3 of households pay no federal income taxes, and the top 10% of earners pay over 70%. In summary, we have a spending problem. Shorn of partisan rhetoric, this analysis highlights a stark political reality. Federal revenues are going to trend toward a range of 17 to 17.5% of GDP, no matter which party is in control and no matter where top tax brackets are set. Given this reality, we can paraphrase Milton Friedman's famous quote about inflation, only this time we'll apply it to budget issues. In modern U.S. history, budget deficits are almost always and everywhere a spending problem. Now, let's look at how our current debt problems are primarily the result of a failed attempt to spend our way out of the great financial crisis. Part 2. Unfortunately, some ideas die a slow death. The noted British economist John Maynard Keynes once famously quipped, "In the long run, we're all dead." Predicting his own mortality was one forecast that even an economist could get right. Unfortunately for the rest of us, Keynes's ideas live on. As the Depression of the 1930s wore on, Keynes hypothesized that, if left to their own devices, market-based economies could become permanently stuck in a state of dysfunction. He prescribed government deficit spending as a solution to try and jumpstart a recovery. Now, while Keynes was a brilliant person and a widely admired economist, his analysis ignored over a century of economic history. For roughly 130 years prior to the Depression, our market-based system had been through many downturns, some of which were quite severe. Not as bad as the Depression, but very severe. But the economy always recovered quickly and robustly without government stimulus in every case. In fact, After World War I, and in other instances, government spending actually contracted, and the economy still recovered quickly. The decade of the 20s wasn't called the Roaring Twenties for nothing. In addition to forgetting his history, Keynes, like most other contemporaries, also misunderstood the Depression itself. At the time, most people believed that the Great Depression was the result of private market failure, evidenced first and foremost by the stock market collapse of 1929. But in fact, the Depression was a worldwide event. And we now know that, ironically, Europe's deficit spending on World War I, which ended in 1919, was the primary international cause of the Depression. Deficit spending in the major European economies, all of whom fought against each other in the war, deficit spending during that time led to inflated currencies and unmanageable debts. Then, disastrous post-war policies only delayed the day of reckoning until the international monetary and financial systems both started to collapse in the early 1920s and then completely fell apart in the early 1930s. In the United States, these international problems were magnified by the Federal Reserve's failure to prevent banking panics from spreading. But at the time, few people understood these realities, and Keynes's deficits are good idea became a staple of most economists, who were only too happy to be put in charge of things, and of the Democratic Party, which had a vested interest in trying to justify FDR's New Deal interventions. The audacity of failed policies. The economics community began to understand what really caused the Depression in the early 1960s. But in politics, convenient ideas die slowly. In The Audacity of Hope, written in 2006, then candidate Barack Obama wrote, "But it was during the stock market crash of 1929 and the subsequent depression that the government's vital role in regulating the marketplace became fully apparent." This philosophy, which was essentially Keynesian in nature, later informed President Obama's response to the Great Recession. In fact, a recovery started just 5 months after Obama took office, which tells us that the recovery itself had virtually nothing to do with his policies. In the 2 recession years before Obama, deficits averaged a little over 2% of GDP. Then, in 2009, under the Keynesian thinking that informed his administration's response, they tried to jumpstart the economy by pushing deficit spending up to almost 10%. Keep in mind, this was in 1 year. At 10% of GDP, this was the biggest peacetime deficit in our history to that point. And the administration didn't stop there. During Obama's first term, deficits averaged 8.4% of GDP per year, an astounding level. Contrary to Keynesian thinking, all of this government spending failed to produce a robust economy. Real GDP grew only 2% annually during the 2010s, or barely over half the rate of the Reagan-Clinton era, which eventually produced the surpluses I mentioned earlier. So instead of a healthy recovery, Obama's failed spending policies produced a near doubling of public debt outstanding. To be clear, this is when things first became dangerous, which is why Standard & Poor's downgraded the U.S. during this period of time. In 2008, debt to GDP was just under 40%. By the time Obama left office, the ratio had risen to 76%. In other words, by 2016, we were in the debt danger zone, where high debt levels left little room for true emergencies like a major war or the COVID-19 pandemic. No margin for error. When the world started shutting down due to COVID, we had a real emergency on our hands. The Trump administration responded with spending that pushed debt up to almost 100% of GDP. Now, in hindsight, this was likely more than was needed. But at the time, there was no way to know how long the lights in the world's factories and offices would remain dark. Had we entered this period with the lower debt levels that preceded Obama, the emergency spending would have only pushed debt up to a moderately high but still safe and manageable level in the mid 60% range. The Biden inflation. When President Biden took office, the economy had been in recovery for several months. Nevertheless, Biden outdid Obama with Keynesian spending. Deficit spending was 12% of GDP in 2021 alone. This time, all we had to show for the failed Keynesian spending was the worst bout of inflation since the 1970s. Part 3. Houston, we also have a chronic spending problem. So far, we've seen that deficits are a result of spending problems, and the misguided attempt to spend our way out of the Great Recession pushed our debts into the danger zone, leaving little leeway for when a real emergency unexpectedly showed up. Now, the third major source of our problems that we're going to talk about here is a bipartisan failure to control government spending, even during non-recessionary periods. The Clinton administration in the late 1990s had the good fortune of inheriting the economy of a lifetime. To their credit, they also held spending in check. Excluding defense and interest, federal spending under Clinton in the late 90s was about where it had been under Reagan in the late 80s. Then things began to change. Let's focus on what I'll call core spending, which excludes defense and interest costs. Core spending as a percent of GDP has risen steadily over the past 25 years. I've focused on either 3 or 4 year periods for each administration that exclude the impact of recessions, the Obama stimulus spending, and the COVID spending discussed earlier. Again, the point of this is to focus on non-recessionary periods and periods not affected by emergencies. Core spending rose from 12.7% under Clinton to 14% under George Bush, and then to 15.8% under Obama. It then leveled out under Trump 1.0 before jumping to 18.1% under Biden, all of which has resulted in dangerous and chronic peacetime deficits of over 6% of GDP annually. Much as what happened with the debts under Obama, this has jeopardized our ability to respond to future emergencies. Summary. It's critical that future leaders accept the reality that, regardless of which party is in power, federal revenues will trend towards 17 to 17.5% of GDP, and our tax code is already about as progressive as it is likely to get. History shows that future policy should focus on eliminating deductions and lowering marginal rates as far as possible within these realities. In addition, Keynes was wrong about the Great Depression, and his ideas failed both after the Great Recession and after COVID, all of which has cost America and the Democratic Party dearly. It is high time that we finally allow Keynesian thinking to rest in peace. As we saw in the Bush administration and have seen again with the House's version of the Big Beautiful Bill, absent strong presidential leadership, Republicans are just as unlikely as their Democratic counterparts to control federal spending and deficits. The Trump administration so far appears to have banked their legacy primarily on reigniting economic growth. But for the sake of our upward mobility, our safety and security, and the viability of our social welfare commitments, we should all encourage the administration to work just as hard on the spending side of the equation as well. Obviously, we have important issues to deal with, but they are no greater than the major challenges we have overcome time and again throughout our storied history. We still have the most remarkable people and the most powerful economic engine in the history of the world. And all we need to do is to unleash our potential. If you found this helpful, please recommend it to at least one other person. If you want to learn more, you can go to my website, toddsheetswriter.com. Well, you'll find a connection to my free newsletter, which is available on Substack. And you'll also find a connection to buy my book about the 2008 financial crisis. Once again, I'm Todd, and here's hoping your day is as bright as America's future.